The morning mist hung low over Pearl Harbor like a shroud of false security. At 0600 hours on December 7, 1941, Seaman First Class Joseph Lockhart stared at the oscilloscope screen at the Opana radar station, his eyes widening as he witnessed what would become one of the most significant radar contacts in American military history. The green blips moving across his screen represented incoming craft, lots of them approaching Oahu from the north at a distance of 137 miles. Commander Mitsuo Fukita adjusted his flight goggles as he led the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft through the early morning clouds. Below him, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, its surface broken only by the occasional whitecap. He had trained for this moment for months, studying reconnaissance, photographs, and memorizing every detail of the American naval base. The success of Operation Hawaii, as the Japanese called it, depended on complete surprise and precise execution. Back at Pearl Harbor, the massive battleships of the Pacific Fleet lay anchored in what the sailors called Battleship Row. The USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and USS Pennsylvania represented the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific. Their crews were beginning another quiet Sunday morning routine. With many sailors still in their bunks or preparing for church services, Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was reviewing patrol schedules in his office at Ford Island Naval Air Station. When the first reports began filtering in, the radar operators had detected large formations of aircraft, but the Army's Aircraft Warning Service had dismissed them as a scheduled flight of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses expected from the mainland. This critical miscommunication would prove to be one of several intelligence failures that made the attack so devastating. According to historical accounts documented by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Japanese strike force had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941, maintaining complete radio silence during their approach. Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was preparing for his morning golf game when the tranquil Sunday atmosphere began to shift. He had received various intelligence reports in recent weeks suggesting increased Japanese military activity, but nothing had indicated an imminent attack on American soil. The prevailing wisdom among military leaders was that any Japanese aggression would be directed toward British or Dutch territories in Southeast Asia. Captain Mervyn Benyon stood on the bridge of the USS West Virginia, observing the morning harbor activities. The 47-year-old naval officer had served with distinction for over 2 decades, working his way up through the ranks with a reputation for tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to his crew. He watched as Liberty boats ferried sailors back and forth between the ships and shore, a routine sight that would soon be shattered by the thunder of approaching aircraft engines. The attack force approaching Pearl Harbor represented months of meticulous planning. Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had conceived this bold strike against American naval power. Yamamoto understood that Japan's industrial capacity could not sustain a prolonged war with the United States, making a devastating first strike essential to Japanese strategic objectives. His plan called for simultaneous attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and other Allied positions throughout the Pacific. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft crossed the northern shore of Oahu, the peaceful morning silence was about to be broken forever. The date that would live in infamy was about to begin, and the course of World War II would be forever altered by the events of the next few hours. At 0755 hours, Commander Fukita gave the signal that would echo through history. Tora, Tora. Tora, the code word, meaning tiger, informed the Japanese fleet that complete surprise had been achieved. Below him, Pearl Harbor lay spread out like a detailed model, with the American warships anchored exactly where Japanese intelligence had predicted they would be. The first bombs fell on Ford Island Naval Air Station, sending plumes of black smoke into the crystal-clear Hawaiian morning sky. Lieutenant Commander Ramsey rushed outside his office building just as a Japanese Nakajima Kate torpedo bomber roared overhead, its rising sun emblem clearly visible on the wings. Air raid. Pearl Harbor. "This is not a drill," he shouted into his telephone, becoming the first American officer to officially report the attack aboard the USS Arizona. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg was making his way to the bridge when the first explosions rocked the harbor. The 52-year-old veteran had commanded the battleship for less than 2 months, but his experience and leadership would be put to the ultimate test. As claxons wailed throughout the ship, sailors rushed to their battle stations, many still wearing their white dress uniforms from the previous evening's liberty. The Japanese attack plan was executed with devastating precision. 24 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers skimmed across the harbor's surface at an altitude of just 40 feet. Their specially modified aerial torpedoes, designed to run in the shallow 25-foot depth of Pearl Harbor. These torpedoes had been fitted with wooden fins to prevent them from diving too deep upon water entry, a modification that Japanese engineers had perfected through months of testing. Seaman First Class Donald Stratton was manning his battle station in the forward gun director aboard the USS Arizona when he witnessed the approach of a high-level bomber formation. The Aichi Val dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, had climbed to 14,000 feet before beginning their deadly descent toward Battleship Row. Their target was clear: the massive ammunition magazines that powered the American battleship's 16-inch guns at 0806 hours. A modified 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb, originally designed as a naval artillery shell, penetrated the Arizona's forward magazine. The resulting explosion was heard 25 miles away and created a fireball that rose over 1,000 feet into the air. The USS Arizona, pride of the Pacific Fleet, was destroyed in less than 9 minutes, taking 1,177 officers and enlisted men to their deaths. Captain Benyon maintained his position on the West Virginia's bridge even as Japanese torpedo bombers pressed their attacks. The ship took 6 torpedo hits along her port side, causing massive flooding and a severe list to port. Benyon continued directing his ship's defense until shrapnel from a nearby bomb explosion mortally wounded him. His final orders were to abandon ship and save as many crew members as possible. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the Maryland, became a primary target for Japanese torpedo bombers. Commander Jesse Kenworthy Jr. felt his ship shudder as the first torpedo struck below the waterline. Within minutes, 5 more torpedoes had torn massive holes in the Oklahoma's hull. The 27,000-ton battleship began rolling to port as water rushed into her compartments. Ensign Francis Flaherty and seamen First Class James Ward were trapped in a turret aboard the overturning Oklahoma. As the massive ship rolled past 90 degrees, both men remained at their posts, directing other sailors toward escape routes while ensuring that the turret's ammunition did not explode. Their heroic actions saved dozens of lives, though both would perish when the battleship completely capsized. Admiral Kimmel stood on the lawn outside his headquarters, watching in stunned disbelief as his fleet was systematically destroyed. Spent bullet crashed through the window behind him. An aide commented that it was fortunate the admiral hadn't been injured. Kimmel's response would become legendary: "It would have been merciful if it had killed me." The first wave of the attack lasted approximately 30 minutes, but the damage was already catastrophic. 4 battleships had been sunk or were sinking, and the harbor was covered with a thick layer of oil that burned with black, acrid smoke. The second wave of Japanese aircraft was already approaching from the north, ready to complete the destruction of America's Pacific Fleet. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft withdrew to regroup, Pearl Harbor had transformed into a scene from Dante's Inferno. The waters of the harbor burned with oil fires that sent thick black columns of smoke thousands of feet into the tropical sky. Through this hellscape, ordinary American sailors would perform extraordinary acts of heroism that would echo through the ages. Petty Officer First Class John Finn was manning a .50 caliber machine gun at Naval Air Station Kaneo Bay when the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived at 0850 hours. Despite being wounded multiple times by strafing fighters, Finn continued firing his weapon for over 2 hours, shooting down several enemy aircraft. His actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor, making him one of 15 recipients from the Pearl Harbor attack. Aboard the capsized USS Oklahoma, Seaman Second Class Willard Bell heard the desperate tapping of trapped sailors inside the overturned hull. Working with a volunteer rescue team, Bell spent the next 36 hours cutting through the steel plates of the ship's bottom, rescuing 32 sailors who had been trapped in air pockets when the battleship rolled over. The rescue operations continued for days, guided by the faint sounds of tapping that indicated life within the twisted wreckage. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua took charge of damage control efforts aboard the burning USS Arizona after Captain Van Valkenburg was killed in the magazine explosion. Despite severe burns and the ship's hopeless condition, Fuqua organized the evacuation of survivors and continued fighting fires until ordered to abandon ship. Leadership under impossible circumstances saved dozens of lives and earned him the Medal of Honor. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a symbol of American determination. Quartermaster Third Class Robert Sedbury was at the helm when Chief Boatswain Edwin Hill cast off the mooring lines and jumped into the oil-covered water to swim back to his ship. As Nevada began moving down the channel, Japanese dive bombers concentrated their attacks on the moving target, hoping to sink her in the narrow channel and block the harbor entrance. Hospital corpsman First Class John Carmichael worked tirelessly at the Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, treating hundreds of wounded sailors and civilians. The hospital was overwhelmed with casualties, many suffering from severe burns caused by the burning oil that covered much of the harbor. Carmichael and his fellow medical personnel worked for days without rest, performing amputations and emergency surgery under the most primitive conditions. According to records maintained by the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, many acts of heroism went unrecorded in the chaos of December 7th, with countless sailors and civilians risking their lives to save others. Aviation Ordnanceman Third Class Donald Young was working at Ford Island Naval Air Station when Japanese fighters began strafing the aircraft parking areas. Despite enemy fire, Young continued loading ammunition for the few American fighter planes that managed to get airborne. He and other ground crew members worked frantically to fuel and arm any aircraft that could still fly, enabling pilots like Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor and Second Lieutenant George Welch to engage the Japanese attackers. Captain Casson Young commanded the USS Vestal, a repair ship moored alongside the Arizona when the magazine explosion occurred. The blast blew Young overboard, but he swam back through the burning oil to reboard his ship. Under his leadership, the Vestal's crew cut the mooring lines and moved the ship away from the burning Arizona, preventing further damage to both vessels. Young's quick thinking and personal courage saved his ship and crew. The destroyer USS Aylwin managed to get underway with only 4 officers aboard, the rest of her crew having been ashore on liberty. Ensign Stanley Kaplan, fresh from the Naval Academy, took command and successfully navigated the ship through the burning harbor to the open sea. The Aylwin became one of the few American warships to actively engage Japanese aircraft during the attack, as the second wave of Japanese attackers completed their mission and turned northward toward their carrier fleet. Pearl Harbor was left, counting its losses and its heroes. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but in that brief time, ordinary Americans had displayed extraordinary courage under fire. These acts of heroism would become the foundation upon which America would build its response to the Japanese aggression, transforming a day of infamy into a catalyst for ultimate victory. Behind the devastating success of the Pearl Harbor attack lay a complex web of intelligence failures, missed opportunities, and bureaucratic miscommunication that would haunt American military leaders for generations. The signs of impending Japanese aggression had been accumulating for months. Yet the pieces of the puzzle were never properly assembled into a coherent warning. Colonel Rufus Bratton, chief of the Far East Section of Army Intelligence, had been tracking Japanese diplomatic communications through the top-secret Magic Intercept program. Throughout November 1941, decoded Japanese messages revealed increasing urgency in Tokyo's diplomatic instructions, including orders to destroy code machines and classified documents at Japanese consulates worldwide. These were classic indicators of impending military action. Yet the intelligence was never translated into specific tactical warnings. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station Hypo in Hawaii, the Navy's cryptographic unit, had been monitoring Japanese naval communications with growing concern. His team had detected unusual radioactivity from the Japanese First Air Fleet, but they could not determine the fleet's location due to sophisticated Japanese radio deception measures. The Japanese had implemented a comprehensive communications security plan that included fake radio traffic from home ports while their attack force maintained complete radio silence. On November 27, 1941, both Admiral Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short received a war warning message from Washington stating that negotiations with Japan had ceased and that an aggressive move by Japan was expected within the next few days. However, the message indicated that the Japanese attack would likely come against the Philippines, Thailand, or the Kra Peninsula. With no mention of Hawaii as a potential target, the radar detection at the Opana station represented perhaps the most tragic missed opportunity of December 7th. Private Joseph McDonald and Private George Elliott Jr. had detected the incoming Japanese formation at 0702 hours, reporting contact with what appeared to be more than 50 aircraft approaching from the northeast. When they telephoned the Aircraft Warning Service Plotting Center, they reached Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, who was serving only his second day as a plotting officer. Tyler made the fateful decision to dismiss the radar contact. Assuming the aircraft were either a scheduled flight of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses expected from California or aircraft from the carrier USS Enterprise, which was known to be operating in the area. This critical error eliminated the last opportunity to provide Pearl Harbor with advance warning of the attack. Had the warning been properly processed, American fighters could have been airborne and anti-aircraft guns manned before the Japanese arrived. Intelligence reports from diplomatic sources had also provided warning signs that were not properly evaluated. Ambassador Joseph Grew in Tokyo had reported increasing Japanese military preparations and anti-American sentiment. British intelligence had warned of possible Japanese attacks on American interests based on their monitoring of Japanese naval movements in the South China Sea. The famous Winds Code message, which Japanese diplomats were instructed to broadcast if diplomatic relations were severed, was intercepted by American cryptographers, but never definitively confirmed. The message East Wind Rain, indicating war with America, was reportedly heard by multiple monitoring stations, but became lost in the bureaucratic maze of intelligence processing. Captain Edwin Layton, Admiral Kimmel's intelligence officer, later testified that the Pacific Fleet had not received adequate intelligence support from Washington regarding Japanese intentions. The Navy's intelligence system was fragmented between multiple agencies, with poor coordination between the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington and the fleet intelligence officers in Hawaii. Perhaps most significantly, American intelligence had failed to locate the Japanese aircraft carriers that would launch the Pearl Harbor attack. The 6 carriers of Admiral Kichinagumo's First Air Fleet had departed Japanese waters in late November, but had seemingly vanished from intelligence. Tracking American analysts knew that Japanese carriers were missing from their normal positions, but could not determine their location or intentions. The Magic Intelligence Program had provided American leaders with unprecedented access to Japanese diplomatic communications, yet this intelligence created a dangerous overconfidence in America's ability to predict Japanese actions. Military leaders became focused on diplomatic indicators, while failing to adequately monitor tactical military preparations. The intelligence failure at Pearl Harbor would lead to a complete reorganization of American intelligence gathering and analysis. The lessons learned from December 7th would eventually contribute to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency and modern intelligence coordination procedures that continue to protect American interests today. The attack on Pearl Harbor represented the culmination of months of meticulous planning by the Imperial Japanese Navy, led by one of history's most brilliant naval strategists, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had conceived the Pearl Harbor operation against considerable opposition from his own naval staff, many of whom considered it too risky and preferring a more traditional strategy. Focused on Southeast Asian objectives, Yamamoto understood that Japan's industrial capacity was roughly one-tenth that of the United States, making a prolonged war virtually unwinnable for the empire. His strategic concept required a devastating first strike that would cripple its American naval power in the Pacific for at least 6 months, providing Japan time to establish an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Central Pacific. The admiral had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921 and understood American industrial potential better than most of his contemporaries. The tactical planning for Operation Hawaii fell to Rear Admiral Ryonosuke Kusaka and Commander Minoru Genda, two of Japan's most innovative naval aviation officers. Genda had studied the British Royal Navy's torpedo attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in November 1940. Recognizing that carrier-based aircraft could successfully attack heavily defended naval bases, the Taranto raid had demonstrated that shallow water torpedo attacks were feasible with proper technical modifications. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, selected to lead the air attack, spent months studying American naval procedures and base layouts. Japanese intelligence had provided detailed reconnaissance photographs of Pearl Harbor, taken by diplomats and naval attaches operating undercover in Honolulu. These photographs revealed the typical Sunday morning disposition of the Pacific Fleet. With battleships moored in predictable patterns along Ford Island, the Japanese strike force that departed Hitokapu Bay on November 26th consisted of 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Haryu, Zuikaku, and Shakaku. These vessels carried 414 aircraft, including Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi Val dive bombers, and Mitsubishi Zero fighters. The fleet was escorted by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. Admiral Kichi Nagumo commanded the strike force with considerable reluctance. Believing the operation was unnecessarily risky and unlikely to achieve decisive results, Nagumo was a traditional surface warfare officer who had limited experience in carrier operations, leading to tension with his aviation staff throughout the planning process. His conservative approach would later influence his decision not to launch a third wave attack on Pearl Harbor's fuel storage and repair facilities. The Japanese had spent months developing the specialized weapons needed for the Pearl Harbor attack. The shallow depth of Pearl Harbor required extensive modifications to standard aerial torpedoes, including the addition of wooden stabilizing fins and impact-sensitive detonators. The armor-piercing bombs used against the battleships were modified. 16-inch naval artillery shells, fitted with fins and special fuses designed to penetrate heavy deck armor before exploding. Lieutenant Commander Shikoro Murata led the torpedo bomber squadrons in the first wave, having trained his pilots to attack in the shallow waters of Kagoshima Bay, which resembled Pearl Harbor's geography. The torpedo attacks required pilots to approach their targets at extremely low altitude while maintaining precise speed and heading, making them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire throughout their attack runs. Zero fighter pilot Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya provided air cover for the attack formations while also conducting strafing runs on American aircraft parked at Wheeler Army Airfield and other military installations. The Mitsubishi Zero was superior to any American fighter aircraft in 1941, giving Japanese pilots a decisive advantage in aerial combat. The Japanese attack achieved tactical surprise due to excellent operational security and strategic deception. Radio operators aboard Japanese merchant vessels provided weather reports and intelligence updates while maintaining the illusion that the strike force was still in Japanese waters. The Japanese had also planted false intelligence, suggesting that their carriers were operating in home waters, contributing to American complacency. Commander Genda had advocated for a third wave attack targeting Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks and dry dock facilities. Recognizing that these installations were more strategically valuable than the battleships themselves, however, Admiral Nagumo decided to withdraw after the second wave. Concerned about American land-based aircraft and the unknown location of American aircraft carriers, the Japanese pilots who participated in the Pearl Harbor attack were among the most experienced naval aviators in the world, with many having gained combat experience during the ongoing war in China. Their training emphasized precision bombing and torpedo attacks under combat conditions, preparation that proved decisive during the Pearl Harbor operation. Despite achieving complete tactical surprise, the Pearl Harbor attack ultimately failed to achieve Yamamoto's strategic objectives, serving instead to unite American public opinion behind total war against Japan. The immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack transformed both the physical landscape of the naval base and the psychological, the landscape of the American nation. As rescue operations continued throughout December 7th and into the following days, the full magnitude of the disaster became apparent to military leaders and civilians alike. The casualty figures were staggering: 2,400. 3 Americans killed and 1,178 wounded. The Pacific Fleet had lost 4 battleships sunk, 4 battleships damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, and 188 aircraft destroyed. The material losses represented decades of naval construction and millions of dollars in military investment. But the human cost would resonate far beyond any financial calculation. Rear Admiral William Furlong, commanding officer of the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, immediately implemented emergency procedures to assess damage and begin recovery operations. The harbor was covered with a thick layer of fuel oil that continued burning for days, creating a hellish environment for rescue workers attempting to reach survivors trapped in overturned vessels. The USS Oklahoma alone had over 400 sailors trapped inside her capsized hull. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received the first reports of the attack while having lunch at the White House with close advisor Harry Hopkins. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox telephoned at approximately 1:35 hours Eastern Time with the initial casualty estimates and damage assessments. Roosevelt's immediate response was to begin drafting what would become his famous date of infamy speech to Congress. The American public's reaction to Pearl Harbor was swift and decisive. Public opinion polls showed Americans divided on whether the United States should enter the European War, with significant isolationist sentiment particularly strong in the Midwest. The Pearl Harbor attack instantly transformed American public opinion, creating unprecedented national unity behind a declaration of war against Japan. On December 8, 1941, Congress convened in joint session to hear President Roosevelt's address. The president's 6-minute speech, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, was interrupted by applause 34 times. The formal declaration of war against Japan passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 388 to 1, with Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana casting the sole dissenting vote. According to historical documentation preserved at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, the president had initially drafted a longer speech, but decided that brevity would be more effective in conveying the gravity of the situation. The investigation into the Pearl Harbor attack began immediately, with multiple congressional and military inquiries examining the intelligence failures and command decisions that had made the surprise attack possible. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were relieved of their commands within days, becoming scapegoats for a systemic failure that extended throughout the American military and intelligence establishment. The salvage operations at Pearl Harbor became one of the most complex maritime recovery efforts in history. The USS Arizona was declared a total loss, but the other battleships would eventually be raised and returned to service. The USS Oklahoma required one of the most ambitious salvage operations ever attempted, using a complex system of cables and winches to gradually roll the massive vessel upright over a period of several months. Captain Homer Wallen supervised the salvage operations with remarkable efficiency, ultimately returning 6 of the 8 damaged battleships to active service. The USS Nevada, which had attempted to escape during the attack, was refloated and completely rebuilt, eventually participating in the DA landings at Normandy. The USS California and USS West Virginia were raised, modernized, and returned to the Pacific Fleet in time to participate in the final campaigns against Japan. The Pearl Harbor attack catalyzed American industrial mobilization on an unprecedented scale. Within months, American factories were converting from civilian to military production. creating the arsenal of democracy that would eventually overwhelm Axis industrial capacity. The attack had awakened what Admiral Yamamoto himself called a sleeping giant, setting in motion the industrial and military juggernaut that would ultimately defeat Japan. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. The attack had eliminated the American battleship force that might have interfered with Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia, but it had also created an implacable enemy committed to total victory. The American aircraft carriers, which had been absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7th, would become the foundation of the naval aviation force that would dominate the Pacific War. The Pearl Harbor attack fundamentally altered the trajectory of World War II and established the foundation for America's emergence as a global superpower. The immediate tactical success achieved by Admiral Yamamoto's carefully planned operation ultimately proved to be a strategic catastrophe for Imperial Japan, unleashing American industrial and military potential that would prove decisive in the Pacific War. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor on American society cannot be overstated. The attack shattered the illusion of American invulnerability, created by two vast oceans, and propelled the United States into a global conflict from which it would emerge as the world's dominant military and economic power. The isolationist sentiment that had characterized American foreign policy throughout the 1930s evaporated overnight, placed by a national commitment to total victory that would sustain for years of global warfare. Military lessons learned from Pearl Harbor revolutionized American defense thinking and intelligence operations. The attack demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional naval forces to carrier-based aviation, accelerating the development of naval air power that would characterize Pacific War strategy. The intelligence failures that made the surprise attack possible led to comprehensive reforms in intelligence gathering, analysis, and dissemination that continue to influence American national security procedures today. The technological innovations developed in response to Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military applications. Radar technology, which had detected the incoming Japanese attack but failed to provide adequate warning, was rapidly improved and deployed throughout the Pacific. Theater. Advanced cryptographic techniques developed to break Japanese codes would later contribute to the development of early computer technology and modern telecommunications. Admiral Bert Chester Nimitz, who replaced Admiral Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, transformed the lessons of Pearl Harbor into a comprehensive strategy for defeating Japan. Nimitz understood that carrier aviation, submarine warfare, and amphibious operations would be the keys to victory in the Pacific, abandoning traditional battleship-centered naval tactics in favor of the innovative approaches that would prove decisive at Midway, Guadalcanal, and other critical engagements. The Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, formed in 1958, has worked tirelessly to preserve the memory of December 7th and ensure that future generations understand both the heroism displayed during the attack and the intelligence failures that made it possible. Annual memorial ceremonies at Pearl Harbor continue to draw thousands of visitors, including surviving veterans whose numbers diminish each year. The USS Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, stands as a permanent reminder of the sacrifice made by the 1,177 sailors and Marines who died aboard the battleship. The memorial is built directly over the sunken vessel, which continues to leak approximately 1 quart of fuel oil daily, creating what many visitors describe as the tears of the Arizona. Historical analysis of the Pearl Harbor attack has evolved considerably since 1941, with scholars recognizing that the intelligence failures were more complex and systemic than initially understood. Recent research has revealed that American codebreakers had access to significant intelligence about Japanese intentions, but bureaucratic problems and analytical failures prevented this information from reaching operational commanders in time. To prevent the attack, the debate over responsibility for Pearl Harbor continues among historians and military analysts, with some arguing that President Roosevelt and his senior military advisors should have better prepared Pearl Harbor's defenses based on available intelligence. However, most contemporary scholars conclude that the attack resulted from a combination of Japanese operational excellence and American systemic failures, rather than any deliberate conspiracy or gross negligence. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended well beyond the Pacific War, establishing precedents for American global engagement that would characterize the Cold War and beyond. The attack demonstrated that geographic isolation could no longer protect America from foreign threats, creating the intellectual foundation for the global military presence and alliance system that defines American foreign policy today. Perhaps most significantly, Pearl Harbor established the principle that surprise attacks on American interests would provoke overwhelming retaliation, a doctrine that has influenced American strategic thinking from the Cold War through contemporary counterterrorism operations. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" became more than a wartime slogan. It became a permanent reminder that American security requires constant vigilance and overwhelming military superiority. The legacy of Pearl Harbor ultimately transcends its immediate historical context, serving as a permanent reminder of both human courage under extreme adversity and the catastrophic consequences of intelligence failures and strategic complacency. December 7th, 1941 remains a date which will truly live in infamy, but also a date that demonstrated the resilience and determination that would carry America to victory in the greatest conflict in human history.